Rome did not believe this war was real. At first it was dismissed as a joke, a handful of escaped slaves, gladiators with kitchen knives, men who were supposed to die for entertainment, not challenge the most powerful republic on earth. Rome had crushed kings. Rome had burned cities. Rome ruled the Mediterranean through fear, discipline, and absolute confidence. And yet, somewhere in southern Italy, something was growing that Rome could not understand and could not control. This was not supposed to become a war. It began, as Rome believed all slave revolts did, with desperation. A group of gladiators at a training school near Capua discovered they were about to be sold, punished, or killed. They acted first. They broke out using stolen knives and cooking tools. They fled into the countryside with no plan, no supplies, and no future. Rome had seen this before. Runaways always scattered. Hunger always finished the job. But this time they didn't scatter. They climbed. They took refuge on the slopes of Mount Vesuvius, a place Rome barely considered dangerous. No fortifications, no walls, no city, just rock, forest, and height. Rome sent a small force, barely an army at all. The kind of detachment you use to restore order, not fight a battle. It never came back. The Roman commander believed the slaves were trapped, surrounded by cliffs, cut off from escape. He set camp below the mountain and waited, confident that starvation would do the work for him. What he didn't expect was intelligence. The slaves gathered vines, they braided ropes. In the darkness, they descended the cliffs where Rome thought no one could pass. At dawn, they struck from behind. The Roman camp collapsed in minutes. Weapons were seized, armor was taken. Discipline, Rome's greatest weapon, turned into panic. That was the moment this stopped being a revolt. Word spread faster than Rome could react. Slaves from farms, mines, and households fled to the mountain. Shepherds joined them. Outcasts joined them, criminals joined them. Men who had never held a sword stood beside men trained to kill for sport. They did not call themselves an army, but Rome soon did. Each Roman force sent to crush them was stronger than the last, and each was defeated, not by luck, not by chaos, but by planning, movement, and adaptation. Rome's commanders underestimated them every single time. They attacked where Roman formations could not function. They used terrain Rome had ignored. They learned quickly how to ambush, how to maneuver, how to turn Roman confidence into weakness. This was not how slaves were supposed to fight. In Rome's imagination, slaves were property, tools that spoke, bodies that obeyed. They were not capable of coordination, let alone strategy. And yet now Roman roads were no longer safe. Supply lines were cut. Entire regions slipped out of control. Villas were abandoned. Landowners fled behind city walls. Fear crept north. The Senate still refused to take it seriously. This was the most dangerous mistake Rome could make because this army did not need to defeat Rome in battle. It only needed to survive. Every day it lived was a humiliation. Every Roman defeat sent a message across Italy. Rome could bleed. As the months passed, the slave army grew into tens of thousands. Its leader, once considered nothing more than a criminal entertainer, proved to be something far more dangerous. He understood Rome. He understood its arrogance, its habits, its blind spots, and Rome had no answer for him, not yet, but Rome would learn slowly, brutally, and when it finally did, it would respond with a level of violence meant to erase the memory of this war forever, because Rome could forgive defeat. What it could never forgive was fear. Rome had a habit of ignoring danger until it could no longer be ignored. For generations, slave revolts had followed the same pattern, a brief explosion of violence. Farms burned, masters killed, then hunger, fear, and Roman steel restored order. The Republic had learned to treat these uprisings as background noise, unpleasant but never existential. That habit would nearly destroy it. As the slave army descended from Mount Vesuvius, it did not behave like a mob. It moved deliberately. Villages were bypassed or looted selectively. Roman patrols vanished. Messengers failed to return. Entire stretches of countryside went silent. Rome responded the way it always did at first, with contempt. The Senate did not declare a war. It did not mobilize legions. Instead, it assigned the task to praetors, men whose role was administration and law, not large-scale command. These were officials expected to restore order, not fight a campaign. They were given poorly trained troops, local militias, hastily raised forces. Men who believed they were marching against runaway property, not an enemy that had already defeated Roman detachments in open combat. The first praetor marched confidently south. He never adjusted his formation, never scouted properly, never considered that the enemy could think. The slave army attacked from broken ground where Roman discipline dissolved into chaos. The lines collapsed. Panic spread faster than commands. When it was over, Roman weapons lay scattered across the field, now in the hands of men Rome insisted could not fight. The Senate blamed the commander, then it sent another, and another. Each defeat followed the same pattern: Roman arrogance, slave adaptability, terrain used as a weapon, surprise attacks at dawn or dusk. Roman formations shattered before they could deploy properly. What terrified Rome was not the losses, it was the learning. The slave army improved with every encounter. Roman shields appeared in their ranks, Roman helmets, Roman swords. They adopted Roman tactics when it suited them and abandoned them when it didn't. They were no longer pretending to be an army. They were becoming one. At the center of this transformation stood a leader Rome would later try to turn into a monster, a bandit, a madman. But in these early months, his actions told a different story. He discouraged pointless slaughter. He imposed discipline. He punished disobedience. This was not the behavior of a man chasing revenge. It was the behavior of someone who understood time. Rome could replace defeated troops. Rome could raise new armies. Rome could absorb losses. The slave army could not. Survival was victory. Italy itself began to fracture under the pressure. The countryside emptied. Wealth flowed toward fortified cities. Landowners demanded protection the Senate could not provide. Local authorities hesitated, unsure whether Roman power still held. Fear spread faster than rebellion. Rome's allies watched closely. Many of them had once been enemies. They remembered what happened when Rome appeared weak, and now Rome looked weak. The Senate began to argue. Some demanded decisive action, full legions, experienced commanders, overwhelming force. Others insisted this would only legitimize the revolt, turning a slave uprising into a civil war in everything but name. They chose delay. Delay was fatal. As winter passed, the slave army did not collapse as Rome expected. It adapted, it scavenged, it raided with precision. It avoided unnecessary battles and struck when conditions favored them. Then came the moment that changed everything. Instead of remaining in the south, the army began to move north. This was unthinkable. No slave revolt had ever done this. Moving north meant approaching the heart of Roman power. It meant threatening major roads, supply routes, and communication lines. It meant challenging Rome's control of Italy itself. Panic rippled through the Senate. This was no longer a regional problem. If the slave army reached the Alps, if it escaped Italy, it could inspire revolts across the Republic's territories. Slavery was the foundation of Roman wealth. If that foundation cracked, the entire system could collapse. Rome finally acted. Two consular armies were raised, not militias, not police forces, but real Roman armies commanded by men who expected glory, not humiliation. They marched south, confident that numbers and discipline would end the embarrassment. They were wrong. The slave army refused to fight on Rome's terms. It withdrew when necessary. It struck supply lines. It forced Roman commanders into unfavorable ground. When battle came, it came suddenly and violently. Roman soldiers died at the hands of men they believed were beneath them. The psychological damage was enormous. Rome had built its empire on the belief that its enemies feared it more than death. Now Roman soldiers hesitated. They had seen defeated commanders blamed, disgraced, and forgotten. They had watched slaves fight with the desperation of men who could not surrender. And desperation is a powerful weapon. Another Roman army broke. Another commander returned to Rome in disgrace. The Senate could no longer hide the truth from itself. This war was real. Italy was burning, and Rome had lost control of the situation it had created. By now, the slave army numbered in the tens of thousands. It stretched across miles of countryside when on the move. It required food, coordination, leadership, and planning on a scale no Roman believed possible for people without citizenship, training, or status. Yet it endured. What frightened Rome most was not what the slaves had done, but what they might do next. Some believed the leader intended to march on Rome itself. Others feared he would cross the Alps, return to his homeland, and ignite revolts beyond Roman borders. Still others suspected something worse, that he understood Rome well enough to know its greatest weakness was internal division. Rome could survive invasion. It struggled with civil war. As fear spread, so did brutality. Roman authorities executed suspected sympathizers. Entire villages were punished. Masters tightened control, desperate to prevent their own slaves from fleeing. The irony was cruel. Every act of repression reminded enslaved people of what they had to gain and what they had to lose. Rome had created a monster it no longer knew how to kill. The Senate's debates turned darker. Tradition no longer mattered. Reputation no longer mattered. Only results mattered. At last they turned to a man who promised order through fear, a man who believed discipline was enforced not by law but by terror, a man who would accept no excuses, no delays, and no mercy. He was given absolute authority. He was given resources Rome had previously withheld, and he was given a single task: end this war, no matter the cost. The arrival of this commander marked the beginning of the end, not because the slave army was suddenly weak, but because Rome had finally decided to be ruthless. This was no longer a campaign to restore order. It was a campaign to erase an idea, to prove that no matter how long they survived, no matter how many victories they won, no matter how close they came to freedom, Rome would always have the final word. The war entered its darkest phase, and mercy disappeared from Italy. Rome had finally stopped pretending. When the new commander took control, the tone of the war changed overnight. There were no speeches about restoring order, no promises of leniency, no concern for appearances. What mattered now was obedience, from Rome's soldiers first and from Italy second. The army he inherited was large, but its morale was poisoned. These men had watched other Roman armies fail. They had seen slaves stand their ground. They had learned that this enemy did not break easily. The new commander understood something Rome had forgotten. Fear works both ways. Before he marched against the slave army, he turned on his own men. Discipline was enforced with methods Rome had not used in generations. Units that fled or hesitated were punished collectively, not fined, not dismissed, killed by lot. Every 10th man was executed by his comrades. It was a message written in blood. There would be no retreat. There would be no excuses. There would be no mercy. The Roman army stiffened, not with confidence, but with terror, and terror, when controlled, was effective. Only after Rome's soldiers were broken and reforged did the commander move. Unlike his predecessors, he did not chase glory. He did not rush into battle. He did not underestimate the enemy. He studied them. He tracked their movements. He cut off supplies and escape routes. Where the slave army moved freely before, it now found roads blocked, valleys sealed, and terrain denied. Rome was learning again. The slave army felt the pressure immediately. Skirmishes became costlier. Raids yielded less. Roman patrols no longer panicked. They held formation. They pursued relentlessly. Still, the slave army survived. Its leader understood the shift instantly. This was not another arrogant Roman noble. This was a man willing to bleed Italy dry if it meant victory. The war became a contest of endurance. The slave army attempted what Rome feared most: movement. They marched south then north, testing for weakness. They struck fast, withdrew faster, and refused decisive engagement. But Rome followed. Where the slave army once dictated the pace of the war, it now reacted. Every delay tightened the net. Every skirmish drained irreplaceable strength. Food became scarce. Winter returned, and with it came doubt. The slave army was not unified by ideology. It was united by circumstance. Freedom meant different things to different people. Some wanted escape. Some wanted revenge, some wanted land, some wanted Rome to burn. As pressure mounted, cracks appeared, arguments over direction, over risk, over purpose. Rome exploited this without mercy. Roman forces drove wedges between groups. They isolated detachments. They crushed stragglers. They offered no quarter, not because they expected surrender, but because terror spread faster than hope. Bodies were left unburied. Crucifixions appeared along roads again, not in response to defeat, but as warning. Italy became a landscape of fear. Still, the slave army refused to die. In a desperate gamble, its leader attempted the impossible: escape. The plan was audacious: cross the sea, leave Italy behind, and scatter beyond Rome's reach. It almost worked, but Rome's power was not limited to armies. Gold bought betrayal, promises dissolved alliances. At the final moment, the escape failed. The army was trapped. Now there was no future beyond battle. Rome advanced methodically, forcing confrontation. The slave army was pushed into ground it could not abandon. Retreat meant starvation. Delay meant annihilation. The final battles were brutal beyond description. There was no maneuver left, no surprise, no terrain advantage, only desperation against discipline. The slave army fought knowing there would be no surrender. They had seen what Rome did to captives. They had watched the roads fill with crosses. They fought because stopping meant death. Rome fought because allowing survival meant something worse: precedent. The clash was chaos. Roman formations strained but held. The slave army surged again and again, breaking against shields and spears, reforming, attacking, refusing to collapse. For hours the outcome was uncertain. Rome lost thousands, but Rome could lose thousands. The slave army could not. When it finally broke, it broke completely. Units disintegrated. Individuals fled. Resistance dissolved into flight. The war did not end cleanly. It ended in fragments. Survivors were hunted down for months. No mercy was granted. No distinction was made between fighter and follower. Rome wanted memory erased. 6,000 captives were crucified along the roads of southern Italy, a living corridor of death stretching for miles. Every traveler saw what happened to those who challenged Roman order. It was not punishment, it was theater. Rome declared victory. Victory tasted different this time. The Republic had won, yet it had been shaken. It had been forced to abandon restraint, tradition, and pride. It had been terrified by men it claimed were not men at all. The Senate avoided discussion of the war. Records were minimized. Credit was carefully assigned. The narrative was controlled. Rome told itself the danger had never been real, but Rome remembered. Laws tightened. Surveillance increased. Large gatherings of slaves were restricted. Fear became policy. Because Rome had learned a lesson it would never publicly admit. For 2 years, an army with no state, no resources, no legitimacy, and no future had survived against the greatest power in the world. Not because Rome was weak, but because Rome had underestimated the cost of desperation. The slave army was gone, but the idea it represented, that Rome could be challenged from within, never fully disappeared. That was the true legacy of the war. And Rome would spend the rest of its history trying to ensure it never happened again. Rome did not celebrate this victory the way it celebrated others. There were no triumphal parades filling the streets, no monuments raised to mark a glorious campaign, no public festivals to honor the dead. The war ended not with relief, but with unease, a quiet that felt unnatural after years of fear. Italy had been scarred, fields lay abandoned, villas stood empty. Roads that once carried trade now carried memories of crosses, each one a reminder that Rome had nearly lost control of its own heartland. The Republic claimed order had been restored, but order was not the same as confidence. The Senate moved quickly to reshape the narrative. Official records reduced the conflict to a criminal disturbance led by bandits and brigands, not a coordinated army. Defeats were blamed on individual incompetence, not systemic failure. The scale of the war was quietly minimized. Rome could accept loss in foreign lands. It could not accept vulnerability at home, so the truth was buried. The men who had fought in the campaign returned changed. Veterans spoke in fragments if they spoke at all. They had seen things that did not fit Rome's story of itself: slaves standing their ground, refusing surrender, fighting with coordination and purpose. Many veterans understood something unsettling. The enemy had not been weaker. They had simply been outnumbered in the end. Across Italy, the survivors of the war lived under a new weight. Masters tightened their grip. Punishments became harsher, faster, more public. Any hint of disobedience was crushed immediately. The memory of fear had turned into policy. Rome did not want obedience, it wanted prevention. Large slave gatherings were restricted. Movement was monitored. Informants were rewarded. The Republic created an atmosphere where rebellion did not need to be punished because it never had time to form. This was Rome's true victory, not the battlefield, the silence. And yet silence is never complete. Whispers persisted in kitchens, in fields, in the barracks at night. Stories passed from mouth to mouth, stripped of names and places, but heavy with meaning. Stories of men who had nothing and almost escaped everything. Stories of an army that had no banners, no homeland, no future, and still made Rome afraid. Rome could not erase those stories entirely. It could only make them dangerous to tell. The leader of the slave army became a problem Rome never fully solved. His body was never displayed. His fate was left deliberately unclear. Some said he fell in battle, others that he was executed quietly, others still that his body was never found. Uncertainty was useful. A martyr could inspire. A ghost could not, so Rome let ambiguity do the work. Over time, the war faded from public conversation, but its consequences did not. Roman politics shifted. Fear of internal collapse sharpened elite rivalries. Trust eroded between classes. The Republic became more willing to use extraordinary violence in the name of stability. What had once been unthinkable became acceptable, because it had already happened. The war also revealed something Rome had long denied. Slavery was not just an economic system, it was a constant risk, a pressure building beneath the surface, requiring endless force to contain. Rome had always believed its slaves were controlled by fear. This war proved fear was temporary, desperation was not. In the decades that followed, Rome expanded faster, fought harder, and governed more brutally. It projected strength outward to avoid looking inward. The Republic could not afford introspection, because introspection led to questions, and questions led to cracks. The war's legacy lingered in Rome's military thinking. Commanders became more cautious. Overconfidence was punished more severely. Intelligence and internal security gained importance. Rome had been surprised once. It vowed never to be surprised again. Yet the irony was unavoidable. The methods Rome used to prevent another such uprising, terror, surveillance, collective punishment, made its society more brittle, not stronger. Fear enforced obedience, but it also poisoned loyalty. Rome won the war, but it learned the wrong lesson. Instead of asking why so many were willing to fight to the death, Rome focused on ensuring they never had the chance again. That focus would shape the rest of its history. Empires do not collapse because they lose battles. They collapse because they refuse to understand the battles they win. The slave army was gone, its leaders were dead, its survivors erased, but the conditions that created it remained. Rome continued to rely on mass enslavement, continued to expand, continued to demand obedience without offering belonging. The Republic believed it had closed a chapter. In reality, it had written a warning, one it would ignore, because Rome could not imagine a future without domination. And domination always carries a price. The war that Rome tried to forget became a shadow stretching far beyond its time. It haunted later revolts, it haunted political violence, it haunted Rome's growing reliance on fear rather than consent. Every time Rome chose terror over reform, it echoed that moment when it had nearly lost everything. The silence after the war was not peace, it was suppression, and suppression, like pressure, always seeks release. Rome believed the war was over the moment the last body fell. The roads were lined with crosses, the survivors were hunted down, the countryside fell silent. By every Roman measure, this was victory, and yet this was the only war Rome refused to remember. There were no monuments to mark its end, no public anniversaries, no proud speeches reminding the people of what had been defeated. Instead, the Republic chose silence because this war exposed something Rome never wanted to confront. Its greatest threat had not come from a foreign king or a rival empire, it had come from within. For 2 years, Rome had fought an enemy that did not seek conquest, it sought escape. It did not march under banners or claim legitimacy. It had no senate, no treasury, no allies, and still it survived. It survived because Rome's system depended on obedience without hope, because millions lived under a structure that offered no future except endurance, until endurance became impossible. This was the truth Rome buried beneath crucifixions and laws. The slave army was not an accident, it was not an anomaly, it was a consequence. Rome's leaders understood this even if they never admitted it aloud. That is why the aftermath mattered more than the battlefield. Surveillance replaced trust, terror replaced restraint, control replaced confidence. Rome did not reform, it doubled down, and in doing so, it ensured that fear became a permanent feature of its rule. War also changed how Rome understood power. Before, it believed domination was enough, that fear alone could hold an empire together. After this war, Rome learned fear had limits, but instead of questioning the system that produced rebellion, it chose to refine repression. That choice echoed through its future. Each internal crisis would be met with greater violence. Each challenge would be crushed more decisively. Each warning would be ignored more completely. Rome survived this war, but it did not grow wiser. The story of the slave army endures because it reveals something uncomfortable about power, something timeless. When a system depends entirely on force, it creates enemies who have nothing left to lose, and people with nothing left to lose are the most dangerous force of all. Rome won because it had resources the slave army could never match: numbers, logistics, time. But Rome was shaken because it realized those advantages were not guarantees. For a brief moment, the impossible seemed possible. And empires fear that more than defeat. That is why this story still matters, not because of how it ended, but because of how close it came to ending differently. Because it reminds us that history is not shaped only by kings and senators, but by the desperate, the ignored, and the forgotten. Rome tried to erase this war, but memory has a way of surviving repression. If you've stayed with this story to the end, thank you for watching. And if you enjoy deep, honest history, the kind that looks at power, fear, and the moments empires nearly lose control, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future episodes. Leave a comment below and tell us what you think this war says about Rome and about empires in general. And finally, let us know where you're watching from. History connects us across time, but also across the world. This has been the story of the slave army that Rome could not kill. And until next time, stay curious and stay questioning.